Good morning. I'm Emily Magruder, Director of the CSU Institute for Teaching and Learning in the Office of the Chancellor, and I would like to thank you for joining us today on short notice for equity-minded practices for remote teaching. The CSU, along with institutions of higher education across the country and the world, has quickly transitioned to virtual instruction during the COVID pandemic. And we wanted to share with you this really important information about being equity-minded as we teach remotely as soon as possible. I believe we have over 200 people joining us today, and this will be recorded and available for later viewing. You can share with your colleagues. One thing that I would like to do as the director of the CSU Institute for Teaching and Learning, I'm eager to check in with you to know how you are doing. So I am going to put into the chat a link to a Google form. This is optional, but if you would like to share with us how you're doing in this transition, then that form is a place to do that. I realize now that most of the questions are geared toward instructors teaching courses, and our audience very likely includes people with many roles. So answer the questions as best you can. This isn't research, it's a check-in. And I've provided an email address at the top if you would like to share suggestions or resources about how we can help everyone who's making this transition to remote teaching and serving our students, which is, of course, the core mission of the CSU. This unanticipated transition from face-to-face to remote teaching in response to the pandemic presents a substantial challenge for many faculty, particularly those who've worked to create a teaching and learning environment that prioritizes equity and equity-mindedness. So I'm deeply honored and grateful that Drs. Frank Harris III and J. Luke Wood, both professors of education at San Diego State, generously agreed to join us and offer this webcast on very short notice. Luke is Associate Vice President for Faculty Diversity and Inclusion and Distinguished Professor of Education at San Diego State University, and Frank is a Professor of Post-Secondary Education at San Diego State University as well. Together, they've done terrific work co-directing the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, and many of you may know them through the Black Minds Matter course that they so generously made available to a wider public recently. Today, Drs. Harris and Wood will present some salient trends and issues that complicate the experience of diverse learners in online courses. Their research demonstrates that students of color are more likely to succeed when an equity presence is created, along with social, cognitive, and teaching presences. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to them, and I will post the link to the survey in the chat once again for people who may have joined us. Frank and Luke.
Good morning, and thank you, Dr. Magruder, for first and foremost organizing this space for us to engage with our colleagues on equity-minded teaching in the online environment. Also want to thank the 200 or so colleagues from the CSU who've taken the time to join us this morning. I will say Luke and I, we get to speak in a lot of different places and engage a lot of audiences. And it's always special when we can actually engage with our colleagues in the CSU. We don't get a chance to do it often enough. So we are both humbled and grateful for the opportunity that we have this morning. Also want to start by acknowledging that these are very challenging times for everyone. And we honor the work that all of you have done to be responsive to the needs of students. This transition from face-to-face and more traditional modes of teaching to being exclusively online is not one that we anticipated. And we know that it's presented some challenges for all of us. So what we're hoping is that the insights that we have to share can just make things a little bit easier during this time. So we've created a hashtag for the webinar. It's Equity Online, and we invite you to post questions on, be it on Twitter or Instagram or LinkedIn, whatever platform that you use. And we encourage you to engage each other and, perhaps create this virtual space that we can engage in and build community for the foreseeable future. Also want to say that before we conclude the webinar, we're going to invite the participants to ask questions using the chat feature in Zoom. And we'll take as many questions as we can given the time that we have remaining. And then also, as Dr. Magruder mentioned, this webinar today does focus on classroom teaching. And we're also excited to announce that we have another one coming up that's going to have more of a student services focus, focus on working with students outside of the classroom. So that webinar is going to take place next week on April 9th from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Pacific time. So, if you get the opportunity and you're so inclined, we invite you to register for that webinar. So now in transitioning to what brings us together today. The objectives for today's webinar are twofold. First, we're going to highlight some of the ways in which culturally diverse students are disproportionately impacted in online courses. And then second, and perhaps most important, we're going to share some strategies for keeping equity at the forefront of the virtual learning experiences that we design and deliver to our students. So we know that many of you who are on this webinar have worked tirelessly over the past several years to reconceptualize the ways in which you teach and support students and to infuse equity into your work. And it is our hope and expectation that we don't lose the momentum that we've established towards this effort over the past several years. Before delving into the content, I'd like to offer 3 important considerations. First, this is not a technical webinar, so we're not going to be teaching you how to use Canvas or Blackboard or learning management systems. We know that there are a lot of colleagues and a lot of opportunities that we've seen floating around for you to build your capacity to do that. But we are focused on teaching practices exclusively in this webinar. And then second, we prioritize racially diverse students in this webinar because these students tend to be the most underserved populations in higher education. Now, that being said, we also recognize that there are other populations of interest and concern, and there's a lot of intersectionality in this regard. And so, we acknowledge that, but want to also be transparent in saying that when we talk about students who are disproportionately impacted, our focus is on racially diverse students. And then the last point is that this webinar, it really is more of an introduction and an overview to these concepts. And we think it's important, and we encourage all of us to continue to build our capacity, to deepen our knowledge, to deepen our understanding of equity-minded practices, and to come up with more ways to make these concepts actionable in the teaching and learning experiences that we have the pleasure and privilege of leading. So let's begin by making sure we have a shared understanding of what equity means. So at its core, equity is about enacting intentional strategies to address disparities that impact students who experience disproportionate impact, meaning students who are not benefiting from their participation in higher education as much as other students. And as I mentioned previously, we're really focused here on racially diverse students. And we also know from our work that there are groups that consistently experience disproportionate impact on almost every indicator of success. These are just a few of them. There could easily be others that could be added to this slide. And again, we also recognize that there's an incredible amount of intersectionality even amongst the handful of populations that are referenced here. And then taking this discussion about equity a step further, it's also important that we embrace the concept of equity-mindedness. And you can think about equity-mindedness as the ways in which we make equity real and actionable. It's the actions that we take, it's the mindset that we bring to bear that makes achieving our equity goals perhaps attainable. And Dr. Estella Ben-Simone, who's a professor in the Center for Urban Education at the University of Southern California, is widely credited with giving us the concept of equity-mindedness. She describes it as being primarily comprised of four primary characteristics. First is recognizing that when we're talking about inequity is a systemic issue. It's not just an issue that's present in education. The same students who are disproportionately impacted in education are also not well served in other social institutions and contexts. So if we're talking about employment, healthcare, the criminal justice system, and so forth, they're disproportionately impacted in all of these systems and contexts. Second is really important. Equity-mindedness requires a reframing of the reasons why students are not successful, not seeing this exclusively as a student success issue, but really also seeing it as an institutional success issue. Third is that we cannot attribute outcome disparities exclusively to students' deficits or identities or life circumstances or capabilities and so forth. In a lot of the work that Luke and I do, we get to hear a lot of reasons why certain groups of students are not successful. And our response to that is, first and foremost, we have to not look at students' experiences and identities as liabilities. We really have to look at them and see them as assets. And it's our responsibility as educators to think about how do we leverage those assets in the learning environments that we are responsible for. And when we talk later in this webinar about culturally affirming and culturally responsive teaching, we'll get at this a little bit more directly. Last point is we have to be reflexive. We have to think about and ask ourselves every day, what is it that I do, or what are some things that I'm not doing that's allowing inequity to either to persist? What are some actions that I'm taking that can help close equity gaps, that can address disparities and so forth? So it's very much a personal investment in the students and in closing equity gaps and taking the actions that are necessary. And then the last point I'd like to offer before I turn it over to Luke is that we have to acknowledge that being racially conscious is at the core of equity-mindedness. And again, it's not to say that we are ignoring other forms of oppression or discrimination and that they're not important and that they should not be acknowledged. But what we want to be careful of is that we don't want to substitute race for some other overlooked identities, right? Our efforts to be equity-minded educators, to close equity gaps, have to have a racially conscious focus. It doesn't need to be an exclusive focus, but it has to be at the core of what we're thinking and what we're doing. And with that, I'm going to transition to Luke, who's going to take us a little bit further.
All right, everyone. Again, I'm glad to be here with my colleague, Frank Harris, III, and joining you on this conversation on what we, of course, is a very important topic in this time. When we're thinking about a transition to virtual or remote instruction in a short time frame, there are a number of different things that we need to consider. We think that there are some important considerations, and two ones in particular that create paradoxes that influence our success with teaching students. The first is that we teach in general, as educators, me included, how we were taught. For example, in the CSU system, we don't have a credentialing for faculty members who are in our classrooms, just in general, even in a face-to-face context. So let's say that your average faculty member in biology may have a bachelor's degree in biology, may have worked in industry for several years, may have a master's and terminal degree PhD in biology, and thus they go straight into the classroom. And most professors in this context were never directly taught how to teach, so they teach how they were taught. And what we've learned from our research is that how they were taught is typically not how our students of color learn. In an online environment, this concern can be even more prevalent because few educators have been previously exposed to online or virtual instruction, let alone high quality virtual instruction. And so when we're thinking about the demographics of students that we're serving, particularly in the context of our own backgrounds as educators, we have to recognize that this can create a gap. And so we have to be really intentional about learning as much as we can about high quality practices and beginning to employ those practices. Next slide. The other issue that we have to be attentive to is to not avoid diversity. We ignore the diversity sometimes that we don't see. Too often our practices indicate that we really just don't believe it's important to be race conscious. And you're going to hear us talk about race consciousness, and we're going to be coming back to that as an important concept. But in an online and learning environment, this can be even more concerning because in this environment, race isn't always visible, depending upon the mode of instruction, particularly if it's asynchronous. Thus, we can ignore the diversity that we don't see because, hey, this is an online course and we might not be seeing our students. And so we may not think that we need to do so. But what we learned from our work is this, is that when we ignore diversity, particularly in these environments, then it can create an environment that's even more racially hostile for some of our students, even more so than the in-person environment, because our default in American higher education is to serve best our white students. So next slide. What we wanted to show you is some data, not from our own system, but from the California community colleges. Our research focuses in post-secondary education in general, but we do a lot of work that focuses directly on community colleges. And what we've looked at is some of their data on synchronous versus asynchronous learning. So the first one here, simultaneous interaction, think about that is a synchronous modality. And what we've done here is we put in red groups that are experiencing disproportionate impact. That's groups that have outcomes that are in general lower than that of their peers in comparison to the overall average. And so what we see here is that in general, we see our Black, Native American, Latinx, multi-ethnic, and Pacific Islander students are students that are oftentimes experiencing disproportionate impact in a synchronous environment. And if you go to the slide, you'll see that they also experience this in an asynchronous environment, but the gaps that you'll see are even more pronounced in an asynchronous environment where we're not instructing in real time, where maybe we're doing pre-recorded PowerPoint videos or previously set up modules and we're delivering that to students. I want to just go ahead and make this point now because I think it's important. That doesn't mean that asynchronous should be done away with. It just means that we have to be far more intentional about how we set that up so that we're being equity-minded in our approaches. Now, if you go to the next slide, what you'll see is a comparison for men across these different modalities. And I should note that, that the data that's available focus on men, focus on women, but unfortunately those who are a gender nonconforming or transgender are not included in and represented in this data. So that is a limitation of what you're seeing. But what you can see right now looking at the data for men is that the greatest gaps are for those who in general are in asynchronous environments and for our Black and Native American men, as well as our Pacific Islander men. Even more so than what we see in in-person environments and synchronous environments. But no matter what, you still see issues of disproportionate impact where we're not doing as good of a job of serving our students who are from these groups in general. For women, on the next slide, you can see that pattern is mirrored, except for the expansion of multi-ethnic students as well. So our Black, again, Native American, multi-ethnic, and Pacific Islander students. And so what we can see from these data is that there are three general takeaways. The first is that our students in online environments experience disproportionate impact, just as we see disproportionate impact in in-person environments. The second point is that the greatest disparities based on this particular data, which may not be totally applicable to our system, but still I think are informative, is that the greatest disproportionate impact is in asynchronous courses. And then third is that when we view these data by gender, that there can be even more nuances in what those disparities look like. Now, again, as I said before, this does not mean that we're going to throw out asynchronous, but it begs the question as to how we actually build these courses with intentionality. Now, with some people, when they see this data, they can rationalize this in different ways. They can approach it from a deficit perspective where we blame students, we blame their families, blame their communities. We say that they're not trying, It's because of all these external things that they have going on in their lives. And in some ways, then rationalizing the disparities as being acceptable. However, from the standpoint that Frank talked about of equity mindedness, from an equity frame, we say, what are we doing or not doing that's resulting in these differences that we see, and recognizing that it's our job as educators to make sure that all of our students can succeed. And if you ever heard myself or Frank present before, you know that we oftentimes use a quote from W. Edward Deming and Paul Batalden that says that every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. So when we see these outcome disparities, they're a function of our system, of how we have built up our own classes and our own modalities of learning that produce even more disparities. So an equity-minded mindset means that we're bringing those conversations and sense-making into the work that we're doing. Next slide.
So before I talk about the common challenges faced by underserved students, I should mention, and should have done this in the introduction, is that Luke and I are both graduates of the CSU. So Luke earned a bachelor's degree and a master's degree at Sacramento State University, and I earned a master's degree at California State University, Northridge. So I thought that was important to acknowledge and put on the record. Okay, so transitioning back to the content, we know from our experiences that underserved students face a multitude of challenges in education, persistent microaggressions, hostile racial climates, basic needs insecurities, a lack of access to experiences and resources that prepare them for college, to name a few. And to provide some examples of this, we know that a critical mass of students of color report that they don't have access to a stable place to live. And this has a significant impact on their success in college, but also their health, their safety, and their overall well-being. And then with regard to food insecurities, we know that this is also a prevalent issue within our system. And we have to ask ourselves, to what degree will the conditions that have emerged as a result of COVID-19 exacerbate these and other basic needs insecurities? So we know, for example, that shelter-in-place orders or a sudden loss of income or lack of access to campus Wi-Fi, that's going to likely intensify a lot of the disparities that students are already dealing with in their regular, when things are sort of normal, I should say, in their educational experiences. And then we have to be mindful about students of color's experiences with social stereotypes. And there are a lot of the social stereotypes about students of color describe them as intellectually inferior, socially deviant, and coming from families and communities that don't value education. And we need to recognize that these stereotypes and their corresponding effects don't just go away in online environments. As a matter of fact, they could actually be more prevalent because they're devoid of the opportunities for students and faculty to establish authentic relationships. And we also have to be mindful about the effects of implicit bias and recognize the conditions in which implicit bias is most likely to be present. The research tells us that implicit bias is usually activated when three conditions are in place. First, at times of high stress. Second, when we have incomplete information. And third, when our time is constrained. And I think we could probably all agree that the recent transition to exclusively online courses has the likelihood of those three conditions being present are very high.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about frameworks. For those of you who have a background in online learning or in virtual learning, you may be aware of Randy Garrison's work on presences. And essentially, he believes that there are presences that must be in place to develop and foster a community of inquiry in this type of setting. And so that's important for us to keep in mind. And so when we think about learning in a virtual space, we really need to be thinking about three different concepts. And I'm going to talk about those concepts, but I'm also going to provide a critique of that, of course, as a scholar in this work as well. So the first one is the social presence. That's in the top left-hand side of your screen. And basically, social presence is described as the ability to project oneself and establish personal and purposeful relationships. And so there's different types of ways that you can do this through effective communication, open communication, through group cohesion. In other words, it's that relational component that we all know is essential to the work that we do. And ultimately what he states is that social presence must move beyond simply establishing social emotional presence and personal relationships. He says that it has to require an intellectual focus. That is, here's key points, that is open, where there's purposeful communication and respect. And so we believe that those are some really key points within that social presence, that we're building that relationship in a way that there is trust, mutual respect, and authentic care. The second is the cognitive presence, and it's defined as the exploration, construction, resolution, and confirmation of understanding through collaboration, reflection, and a community of inquiry. And essentially thinking about it as moving beyond that to where we are allowing students to engage in processes where they're exploring, where they're integrating, and most importantly, where they're applying the information. Because what good is the information that we give if they're not able to apply that information, right? And then the third one is a teaching presence. So, and what he says is that faculty need to engage in designing, facilitation, and direct instruction that fosters higher order thinking, right? So pushing students to their highest level of performance within that zone of proximal development. And that this has to be done through both facilitation and direct instruction. And in some ways, and I think of this as akin to Naveet Sanford's work on challenge and support. Our job is to challenge students to the highest level that we can while also providing them with that necessary support. Now, just like any other theory, when a theory is created that's in general, that doesn't necessarily have a specific focus on minoritized communities, it's helpful, it's contextual, but it's still missing some pieces. And so what we see is that there are three major challenges that our students face that we have to be aware of, particularly our underrepresented students, that require us to make modifications to this presence. So on the next slide, you'll see the first one, which is invisibility, where when we engage with educators as part of the research that we do on effective and promising practices for online instruction, one of the things that we see is this pattern of invisibility where, and this one educator said, where students of color in my online classes often express feeling invisible as what they say doesn't matter. And I think that we communicate this in a number of different ways. We have to recognize that we may not have content and curricular that is culturally relevant, that is designed to reach students. And in reality, most of our courses are set up in ways that are designed to reach majority students, not students who come from minoritized communities. So that can create an even greater feeling of invisibility. The next one are issues of accessibility. And we have to think about this quote here was taken before we made this in rapid transition to a virtual instruction, remote instruction in the wake of our coronavirus pandemic. And you can see that this educator said that some of our most underserved students of color might not have laptops with a camera and microphone. Given this, the online classroom should be portable and able to be viewed with a handheld phone. Some might argue that there are not enough computers at libraries and centers that students can use. That might be true. Think about this, and as an aside for a moment, what does that look like when they don't have access to physical libraries and centers in many cases? They said that that might be true, but as a matter of a student having the time to go to the library or center, which would need to be just about every day to use the computers. Also, the computers at most libraries or centers have a time limit. The phone allows the student to connect to the classroom while they're on the bus, on lunch break, or at home helping their kids with their homework. So in our current social context, where we have made this rapid transition to remote learning, we have even greater issues of accessibility. Students may not have computers, but we've set up assignments that really are done through computers and may not be as accessible through pads or smartphones. They may not have access to Wi-Fi, and effective Wi-Fi, to be able to maintain that connection during a physical class section, particularly if it's a synchronous section. And then the last major concern that we see is around external pressures. And, we oftentimes see this manifest by the disappearing student. Many of us will have students who are in our classes, they'll be taking classes with us, they'll be going and maybe even doing well, and then partway through the semester, they just disappear. Well, we're seeing that as an even more bigger concern right now because of the external pressures that students are facing. Many of our students, if they're from minoritized communities, may be in jobs where they don't have the option, they still need to work. Or if they don't have work opportunities, now they're looking at financial impact and what that looks like. So we know that when there's times of crisis that all communities are affected, but communities of color tend to be even more affected during these times. And as one person said, attendance and time management can sometimes be problematic for underserved students of color, not because of them, but because of the various responsibilities within the family structure and the challenges that they sometimes encounter in life. These issues do not simply disappear in an online course. In fact, they can be even more relevant. And in this current time, those pressures are even more prevalent. And so on this next slide, what we would really like to say to you is this: that we can have a social presence, we can have a cognitive presence, and we can have a teaching presence, but all of that is going to be devoid of effect for our minoritized students if we don't also have an equity presence. Because without a lens of equity, you have a lens of oppression. We have to be equity minded. We have to have, for example, an institutional responsibility where we're taking responsibility for students and their success. If there's challenges, then we don't point the finger and look at them, but we think about what is it that we're not doing. We have to reject those deficit perspectives, again, where those blame students, their families, and their communities. And we have to be intentional about supporting our most underserved students. And even think about it like this: how have I structured my class? And is that resulted in me structuring inequity for certain students from certain communities? So we have to bring an equity-minded mindset into a community of inquiry if we want our underserved students to be successful. Next slide. So we're just, now this, and I know I want to provide a caveat here that we have shown a number of slides that deal specifically with community colleges, and that's largely because, our work and research focuses on that context, but we do think that there are certain things that are applicable for that. And one of the surveys that we have is called the Community College Instructional Development Inventory. It's a national survey that we have of community college faculty, many of whom teach at our universities as our lecturers and part-timers. So I think that there are some commonalities here that we have to be aware of. But one of the things that we've seen in our data is we ask them, what are your greatest areas of need for professional development, professional learning? On the next slide, you'll see what is one of the areas they said that they don't need training in. They say that the first two big areas that they don't need training in racial microaggressions, and they don't need training in inclusive teaching practices. From my perspective, right now we have to be even more attentive to these things if we're going to be successful. Let's take racial microaggressions. As Frank mentioned, we know that implicit bias is manifested when there are several conditions in place. First, when we have incomplete information. The second, when our time is constrained. And the third, when we're experiencing stress or we're in a heightened emotional state. Those three conditions are even more apparent right now than they've ever been before. So that means that the conditions for implicit bias, and of course they manifest through microaggressions, are even more prevalent now. And so what we're seeing that at this moment, that we have faculty members and student affairs practitioners who are either at their best right now in terms of serving students or at their worst. And there's a large chasm in between. And so what we want to do is remember first and foremost that a virtual environment is not devoid of race. We still have to be racially conscious. And the second part of that is that we have to have inclusive teaching practices. We have to have inclusive practices on the previous slide. We have to have inclusive practices that are intrusive for our students, that reach out to them proactively rather than waiting for them to come to us. This slide, you can see that there are lots of different training needs. Ultimately, what you're going to see is that these are the biggest ones when it comes to teaching our most underserved students, and several of the different strategies that we're going to talk about touch upon these strategies and practices right now. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask Frank to fast forward past these slides and move into his part where we get into some of the content.
Awesome. Thank you, Luke. So a few things as we start to propose these practices. First is to understand that the strategies that we're proposing, that they emerge from a rich body of work that we've been engaged in since 2011. Second is that all of the practices that we'll present are aligned with the concept of equity-mindedness, which we've talked about extensively thus far, and our socio-ecological outcomes model, which serves as a conceptual framework for the work that we do. We don't have time to really unpack the constructs of the SEO model, but essentially the model sort of tells us that it helps to highlight the salient experiences both within the campus context and outside of the context of the campus that has an influence on students' success. And then the last point I'd like to offer is that some of the practice we'll share are going to be broadly applicable, while others might be more applicable in specific concepts. So just keep these things in mind as we present them. So to infuse equity-mindedness in virtual teaching and learning environments, we must do 5 things. We must be intrusive, we must be relational, we must be culturally relevant and affirming, we must be community-focused, and we must be race-conscious. And in presenting these strategies, we're going to share some representative quotes from equity-minded colleagues who've taught online and shared their experiences with us in a recent project that focused on infusing equity in teaching.
So the strategies that I wanted to talk about first is dealing with being intrusive. And we think that this is a absolutely critical strategy. So being intrusive means that we don't wait for students to fall through the cracks. We don't wait for students to go on and miss multiple assignments or to be disengaged, because what we've learned from our work is that if you wait for that to happen, it's much harder to bring the student into the fold who's made the determination that they're going to leave than to intercede before it's too late. So we want to be proactive in reaching out to students. And there's a number of strategies that we can do to do this. On the next slide, you'll see 3 of them, or 4 of them rather. The first thing that we can do is to conduct an informal assessment of students' experiences in the online environment. So if we were beginning our semester like this, we would say that this would be the first thing that you would do during your first class or even in advance of that first class. But given that the immediate transition to remote, this is something that if you haven't done, you should do now. And these are just some sample questions, but there's lots of different questions you can ask. Some sample questions include, is this your first time taking an online course? How are you accessing the course? Are they using a computer, a mobile phone, a tablet? You know, what are your concerns in taking this class? How can I best facilitate your learning in this class? And are there other concerns that you have? What you need is essentially foundational information so that you can know what you're working with. Otherwise, you'll assume that they have what they need when in reality they might not. And that might lead to you making different determinations about how you're going to reach them. The second one is to prepare and email students a brief introduction video that introduces them to the learning management system and other technology. Now, many of you might be using Blackboard or Canvas as your primary mode, but if you're also using Zoom or Connect or some other strategy, just remember that many of them may not have had an introduction to you through those modalities. So I would say do that and reach out to them. But here's a very important point here. When you do that, either introduction or reintroduction video to the class. Make sure that you're being positive in this time where everything can be seemingly overwhelming and depressing. Make sure that you're communicating validation that they can do it, that you believe in them, that they can succeed. These are important messages that our students need to hear right now. You should also provide asynchronous alternatives. Now, asynchronous is going to be those things that are not in real time. You might even be asking yourself, why would I would say that, given the data that we showed that asynchronous is not as effective in particular right now. And that's because, again, it's not about throwing out asynchronous. It's about building it with equity in mind, remembering that we need to be as flexible as possible and for providing those opportunities. So let's just say that you have a Zoom class and you're doing it in real time, recording that class section or key parts of that class section and making it available afterwards, right? So thinking about how you can do that to make sure that you're providing as many alternatives as possible. And then the last one is you're recording those sections to make it available to them, but that doesn't mean that you would say that you're not expecting them to be at class, in person through the virtual modality. You're just saying that there's another additional option, but there should be more flexibility. And let me say this, it's an important point. As educators, many of us right now are giving ourselves grace with how we're approaching the work that we're doing, whether it's the research activity that we have, the ways that we're approaching our teaching and learning practice. So if we're going to give ourselves grace, then we also need to make sure we're giving our students grace as well. Next slide. We also need to make sure that success in the course is transparent. So before I go into these strategies, I want to say this, it has to be done in a careful way. You want to make success transparent while also not putting down your students. Like, for example, you wouldn't start out your class in this new modality saying, well, this was a really difficult class, so I can imagine it's going to be even more difficult right now. And unfortunately, we've heard examples of faculty members at institutions across the country doing that. What we want to do is to make success transparent by still communicating with that we believe in their ability to reach that marker. Here's an important point. Remember this, no one has ever risen to low expectations. No one has ever risen to low expectations. So high expectations are key. And we need to continue to communicate that while also continue to communicate what we believe will make the student successful. So being transparent and being proactively answering the question, what will it take for you to be successful in this class? What resources are available? Now, many of our institutions have sent out numerous notes on basic needs supports, on how students can access tutoring, on access to Wi-Fi and computers, to student services that are now transitioning to virtual environments. So we want to make sure that not only are we aware of those resources, but we're proactively passing those information on to students, because given the barrage of emails that students have seen, they may not be getting everything. And so we need to make sure that they're getting it more than once, not just from the university overall, but they're also getting it from us. It's a great way to pass on information, but most importantly, it's a way of demonstrating that we care. And then you could also then, talk about how should they approach the readings, begin to study and prepare for exams, take and organize notes. All those are important strategies that we need to just be proactive about answering so that students are fully aware of what our expectations are for them. Because in an online environment, our expectations may have transitioned, and we're seeing that as a pretty common theme. On the next slide, you can see that there's another strategy that we suggest, which is use assessment strategies that focus on continuous improvement and progress towards demonstrating proficiency. So let me just say this. If you had originally set up your class to be a midterm and a final, that may not be the best approach right now. I'm not saying that that is something you should just immediately do away with, but it's something that you should at least really think about and revisit, because we need to make sure that we're meeting learners where they are and not what is best for us, but what's best for them. So think about maybe employing smaller assignments with lower point values versus larger assignments with big point values, especially given the need for flexibility. Also, You'll see here that Davidson suggests non-text-based assignments. So giving students opportunities to do and demonstrate the knowledge that they have through multimedia presentations, speeches, debates, role plays. They could use Google Hangout to do that. There's lots of ways they can do that. But no matter what you do, make sure that you're giving lots of feedback. And that feedback needs to be even more positive than normal, so that we're validating students on areas where we can authentically validate their performance. It doesn't mean that we're not giving honest feedback, because we have to do that. But feedback should be personalized to the extent that as possible. So you should include notes about students' improvement, resources that they might find helpful, suggestions on how they can extend ideas and concepts. So the feedback must be there. And you should be offering alternative course grading options if that's possible for your class. Now, again, I want to make it clear that's not possible for every class, but that's something that you might want to think about depending upon what the assignment might be. Again, flexibility right now is key. Now, when we talk to educators, you can see that there are some things that they say to us that are particularly important for us to mind. Around this whole concept of being intrusive is performance monitoring, right? That's interceding before it's too late. And here's what educators said to us. They said, you must monitor them and catch problems and address them before it's too late. Loss of points for attendance and submitting assignments discourage students from persisting. If it is late on an assignment and figured they will lose so many points a day, 3 days late, they will most likely not see any point in submitting a late assignment. Then there's a snowball effect. One, they are late and do not turn in several assignments. They do not see a need to continue to attend the class. The end result can be a failed grade, a couple of failed grades, and they do not see a need for continuing in. So this doesn't coddle students. I don't want to suggest that in any way. But what we want to do is create a net of support that's so tight that students cannot fall through it. So what we're doing is that we're maintaining high expectations, providing even more support than we normally would. And I want to say this, I recognize that many of us are doing the incredible work right now. We're being more engaged, we're providing more support, and that is what we have to be doing in order to meet this moment. We have to be going above and beyond because that's what our students need. I recognize that that's harder, but ultimately our job is to ensure that our students are successful. So that is part of the work that we need to be doing. On the next slide, you can also see that there are other things that we think are important. Intervening. So if you don't have an early warning for your class, if you have certain LMSs like Blackboard, you should set one up, or you could just use the general rule of thumb. If I see a student who's missing some assignments, turning in assignments late, coming to class sessions, if it's asynchronous a little bit later, leaving a little bit early, whatever patterns that might suggest levels of disengagement, I want to intercede. So using an early warning system to track that progress and then interceding before it's too late, but in a way that demonstrates that you care. So you can say, as one educator said, I use an early warning system to try to help students that are not turning in assignments, such as phone call and some words of encouragement, and the allowing them to get some points for their efforts. I try to reach out before things get out of control. Now, as an important point to consider here, when we're talking about students of color, and even more importantly, at an intersection of race and gender, men of color, we oftentimes find that they are apprehensive to seek help. Students of color may be apprehensive to seek out help because of racialized stereotypes that suggest that they are academically inferior. Worried about reaching out and asking for help, they're worried to show that they don't know. Then for some of our men, in particular our men of color, there's social stereotypes for men around what it means to be a man. And those are hegemonic perspectives that of course aren't healthy, but we also find that they may view help seeking as a sign of being weak or inferior. So we have to recognize that some students, because of these stereotypes, will be more apprehensive to engage, which is why being intrusive is even more important. And the last point here is referrals. Very important point here. We have to connect students with institutional agents who are going to be validating, who have high expectations for them and care about their success. We've talked about this point as connecting students to people, not services. So let's say that you're teaching your class and you find out that a student needs tutoring. or they really need to connect with financial aid, or that they are really struggling with work and they need to go to our career center, right? And now all those services aren't necessarily in person anymore, so we would have maybe have normally walked them over and handed them off to somebody, but now instead we need to make a connection to those services. But we want to connect students to people, not services, because not everyone in career services, not everyone in financial aid, not everyone in tutoring, not everyone in service learning is going to care about them in the same way that we do. So we want to identify those that we know care about students who come from minoritized communities and care about the success, and then make sure that we're making connections with those individuals. We've oftentimes talked about this concept as building an underground railroad, and remembering that ultimately that the Underground Railroad did two things. The abolitionists advocated for creating a network where individuals could get to the individual that they needed to get to next, so they could get to safety and freedom. And so that's connecting them to the people that we need, while they ultimately work to end and abolish the system that necessitated that need. And so we want to, of course, with our institutions overall, be pushing for them to be more equity-minded. Frank.
Okay, so I'm going to take the next three strategies, and then Luke is going to take us home with the last one. But our next strategy is about being relational. So here's what's important to understand. Authentic relationships between students and faculty that are grounded in trust, mutual respect, and authentic care, whether we're talking about an in-person environment or online environment, are absolutely critical to student success. And these relationships are more likely to be established, particularly when we're talking about underserved students and underserved students of color, when faculty take on the responsibility of creating the conditions for them to emerge. So one of the most important things that we can do, especially in today's context, is to let students know that we are invested in them and their success. And some of the ways in which we do that is, first and foremost, we humanize ourselves. So when we talk with students and we ask them to tell us about a course or tell us about an instructor in which you had a lot of success in and a lot of success with, one of the things that students often tell us is that we like the instructors that are quote unquote down to earth. And when we probe them further and ask them to explain what that means, invariably they tell us, well, we like the instructors that shares information and shares things about themselves, that tells us about their experiences, that tells us about their academic journeys, that tells us about challenges and things that they may have overcome. Students really find that as being a way that it reduces power dynamics, it reduces barriers, and it gives them an opportunity to see and establish perhaps some common ground with their instructors. So we've had colleagues that talked about being transparent with students about perhaps having a learning disability, or perhaps struggling with imposter syndrome and things that students themselves may also be challenged with. We also think it's important that you are willing to engage students on both academic matters, so things that are directly related to your course, as well as non-academic matters, right? So a student may come to you, maybe you're teaching a course in political science, or maybe you're teaching a course in biology, but students come and talk to you about some of the concerns they're having with Access Campus resources, or career things related to their career goals and so forth. Another thing that we can do, and this is a good assignment, particularly if you're just launching an online course. We know right now we made this transition in the middle of the semester, so it may be difficult to do now. But thinking about this and moving forward, what are some strategies and things that you can do that can give you information about each student that has nothing to do with the fact that they're a student in your class? So, maybe giving us a small assignment at the beginning of the semester, perhaps have students record a video or a discussion board course post or whatever it may be that has them share information about who they are, their hometowns, their hobbies and activities. Again, this information may seem trivial and it may seem unrelated, but it provides a potential opportunity for you to connect with students and connect with students in a way that allows you to start to build an intentional relationship with them. We also have to convey unconditional positive regard, right? And what this means is that no matter what students do or how they may perform, that we consistently communicate that we believe in them, we validate them, we let them know that, we think that they have what it takes to be successful, that they belong here, that we understand that this is a challenging time, or maybe they did not do as well as either of us expected, but if they make some adjustments and do these things, that they could actually achieve and meet your expectations. Absolutely essential. We also have to be mindful about deficit perspectives. All of us, Luke and I included, we've all perhaps have been socialized towards this traditional paradigm of what student success is and what a successful student looks like. And we have to think about what that means, and we have to think about how does that create barriers to us reaching out to students and to us supporting students. Validation and positive messaging is critical. It doesn't have to exclusively be something that we say to students. We can think about comments and feedback on assignments, which Luke talked about earlier as being really important in a virtual environment, as an opportunity to validate students as well. And above all, it's not about coddling students. It's never about lowering expectations, because that doesn't serve anyone any good. But it's about letting students know, I'm going to challenge you to meet these expectations. And not only do I expect you to be able to meet them, but I'm also going to support you in being able to meet them. Our next strategy is we have to be culturally relevant and affirming. One of the most important things that we can do as faculty members in order to infuse equity into our online teaching is to make our course content culturally relevant. We're going to spend a couple minutes talking about what exactly that is. So in doing so, we must be very intentional in helping students make connections between the content we're teaching and issues, experiences, and perhaps challenges that are present in their daily lives. So for example, a student who may be studying urban planning might find it important to learn about the intersection of sustainability and social equity, as an example. A business student might benefit from learning about social entrepreneurship as a strategy to improve marginalized communities. A student in the marine biology course might benefit from learning about how access to local beaches is a longstanding equity issue. Gloria Latson-Billings and other scholars who have studied culturally relevant teaching also contend that it is important to center diverse students in every aspect of the course, including the curriculum, the readings and texts that we select, guest speakers that we invite in, and the assessment strategies that we use to assess student learning, to name a few. They also tell us that the benefits of a culturally relevant teaching and learning experience is manifold. So we know that they're well documented. Now I will say this, most of the research in this area has been focused on the K-12 context, but there are some scholars who've studied this also from looking at post-secondary education. And to summarize, this is what they say. A culturally relevant and affirming learning experience is beneficial to historically underrepresented and underserved students on several non-cognitive outcomes. So thinking about self-efficacy, meaning, to what degree students are confident in their ability to be successful. Intrinsic interest, so as a student, am I genuinely interested in the things that I'm learning? So we can think about how being able to infuse, being able to see the relevance between the courses and the course content and issues that are present in their lives and in their communities, how that might increase intrinsic interest in the course. Sense of belonging, so as a student, do I feel like I belong here, that my presence is welcomed here? Perceptions of degree utility, so to what degree do I believe as a student that the time I'm spending in this learning environment and the actual degree that I'm going to earn, that it's going to be value added for my life and for my career? And then with regard to our work on men of color, we find that this is important for helping men embrace healthier concepts of gender masculinity. So thinking about, issues related to toxic masculinity and how, having a culturally relevant and affirming learning experience might help to challenge some of those concepts. And then we also know that it's not just beneficial for students of color, but all students. So including those who may be more privileged in their educational context, they also have something to gain from a culturally relevant and affirming learning experience. So two of our colleagues discussed some of the strategies that they employ to create a culturally affirming learning experience for their student. One colleague talked about course text and had this to share. Select literature and reading material that are inclusive of students of color. This is important when creating an online environment that will address the needs of all students. Students of color normally find that their voices are absent from the literature. So having multicultural readings validate the experiences of students of color. Another colleague talked about the importance of approaching assignments from a universal design perspective and giving students some agency in demonstrating their learning. This colleague shared that universal design for learning has also been effective. All students in my online course are graded via diverse forms of assessment. Students in my class can submit a PowerPoint, a poem, a written paper, or produce a video demonstrating their learning. This gives students the opportunity to choose how they best demonstrate what they understand and learn best, often empowering them to produce knowledge. And then finally, another colleague talked about the importance of using diverse imagery in PowerPoint presentation and other course artifacts, something that we may not even, that may not occur to us as being important. But they had this to share. Faculty use PowerPoints that will tend to use stock images that only have white people. If the subject is not, quote, diversity, unquote, they default to images of white people. I encourage folks to use multiple race, gender, age, ability images to be inclusive of the subject as opposed to a singular group. Another shared, I think about the images I use in the online environment. Being conscious about this is important. The aesthetic of the online environment. It is a welcoming environment for all students, but particularly minoritized students. And then our next strategy focuses on being community focused. It's important that faculty model the type of engagement that we expect to see from our students. So, being present in all aspects of the course, modeling the engagement. Luke shared earlier that it might be helpful to ask students to introduce themselves in a short video. It would be important to do some of the same things. So think about the questions that we posed a few slides ago about our hometown, our hobbies, things, favorite books, favorite movies, things of that nature that really help to build a sense of community. And then making sure that we're active in the class discussion boards and group chat forums, and not just there looking to evaluate the quality of students' responses, but also contributing to the discussion and helping to move it along. And having a set of community norms that are established at the beginning of the course and agreed upon by both students and faculty is also an important way to build and sustain community. Now, I would say at a minimum, these norms should establish expectations for communication. How are we going to communicate and how often? How are we going to give feedback to students, to each other? How are we going to be critical but constructive? And then, appropriate language and how we share perspectives and so forth. It's also helpful, and again, we have to be, mindful about the range of access to technology that our students have. Some students are going to have, more tools at their disposal than others. But being able to see each other during synchronous class section, that also helps. So, asking students to share their camera during synchronous class sessions. And then also, it's important to provide opportunities for students to engage outside of class. And I would say if you require this type of engagement, it would be important to award points to students for doing so in order to incentivize it and to ensure that they take it seriously. And then students can also build community by sharing and exchanging perspectives on topics and issues that are related to the course. But again, they have to be relevant to their daily lives and experiences. So one colleague shared that, students can often share stories with each other, creating communities of scholars and leaders seeking ways to better communicate their lives and experiences. So thinking about so we know Zoom, for example, has a breakout group feature. And sometimes that's a helpful way of getting students to be more open and to engage in dialogue. If, we have a larger class section and we can sort of break up and construct groups that have maybe 4 or 5 students. We find that some students are more willing to engage in that regard. And then also collaborative learning. So, thinking about it for both in-class sessions as well as longer-term projects. And if you're going to do this, make sure you give students the tools that they'll need to collaborate effectively. So don't assume that just because they're adults and some of them, are working and they've had careers and so forth, that they actually know how to do this effectively. So giving them some guidelines, creating a rubric that allows them to do some self-assessment on how they're collaborating as a group, periodic check-ins with each group. This will all increase the likelihood that it'll be a valuable learning experience for all students who are involved. And I'll say, Luke and I primarily teach graduate students, and we find that we even have to do this with our graduate students as well. There needs to be a certain amount of scaffolding that's in place with, how students collaborate effectively. And then the last point I'd like to make is to make sure you're intentional about how you form groups. So sometimes self-selection is not always the best approach. Sometimes students may not know each other, or again, they may have certain stereotypes about how certain groups of students can contribute. So thinking about how you can be intentional in forming groups is also another important strategy in this regard. And then Luke is going to share this last strategy, and then we will use the remainder of our time. We recognize we're over time, but if there are questions, we'll be happy to take those.
Yes, and I can do this quickly. The last one, because I talked about it throughout already, and so is Frank, is being race conscious, and that is, I mean, in my mind, one of the most important strategies, and it really means that we don't ignore race. We can't ignore conversations on race because that is the life and experiences of the students that we serve. So there's a few things that we recommend. On the next slide, you'll see the first one is to be intentional about providing opportunities to engage racial and equity issues within the course context. Now, I'm gonna be real, this doesn't work for all classes, but when it does work, it's even better. Talk about issues of disparity, and there's a lot of disparity that's going on right now, so being real makes for a better connection with students. Give students the tools that they will need to productively engage in racial dialogue in the course. Now, and then also make sure that you have the tools to facilitate that. As some basics that I think are important for this is Daryl Wing-Su's work on microaggressions would be helpful. I would think Chester Pierce's work also on microaggressions would be helpful as kind of general frameworks to help understand the messages that people might be receiving. I'd also like to recommend Sean Harper's Racial Justice Institutes that are designed to help build capacity. These are through the USC Race and Equity Center, and you can go get those by going to race.usc.edu. That's race.usc.edu. And then, of course, you want to stay present in the dialogue and monitor it regularly and intervene when necessary. But here's an important point here. In engaging this type of dialogue, it's best if it's done through simultaneous rather than through an asynchronous modality. And the reason for that is that messages can be lost in translation when it's just textual based, because the person's intent, what they're trying to express, can sometimes not be totally conveyed. So we'd recommend avoiding that approach if you can. It may be better to have a breakout room in Zoom, but no matter what you do, you need to monitor it, because we have the responsibility to ensure that our students of color are not being microaggressed in the classroom. And then the last one that we'd recommend around this topic on the next slide is embracing racial discourse and addressing microaggressions. So I'll take the last one first. When there are people, there are microaggressions. And that doesn't mean that they go away in an online environment. So as this faculty member said, you need to monitor discussion groups for microaggressions. In online classes, the discussion board are a major point of contention. Folks make comments, many from their limited racial experiences, that tend to have all kinds of racial overtones. Many faculty don't have the skills to address those issues. And the last part of this is by embracing racial discourse. We can't move away from it because it may be more difficult to facilitate. And in fact, in these times, these conversations may be even more heightened. And that's why this one faculty member said, I'm always thinking about race in the ways I design, teach, and interact with my students online. I intentionally infuse race into my work. I try to facilitate dialogue and pose questions that address issues of race and racism in society. We talk about these issues. Next slide.
And so that brings us to the conclusion of this webinar. We recognize that we are 10 minutes past time, and we do apologize for that. And thank you all who've been able to stay on. We also want to remind you that the webinar has been recorded and is going to be fully captioned as well. So, there'll be an opportunity to revisit some of the content that we shared. And with that, we'll take a few questions. Luke, I don't know how much time you have, but maybe we can take a few questions before we sign off.
Yeah, I can take a couple questions right now if you can.
Yep, happy to do it. Go for it.
So I'm going to take the first question that's in the chat window, and then Frank, if you can open up the Q&A and take a look at those.
Yes, doing it now.
So the first one that I want to point out is, and this is coming from Denise Dawkins. It says, "Do you think microaggressions and racial discourse causes Black and Brown students from pursuing careers in science and health care, especially nursing?" And I would say yes, overwhelmingly yes. And in fact, my wife, who's also on faculty at San Diego State, has done a lot of work looking at Black female students in the sciences and their experiences with microaggressions. And it certainly impedes their success. Oftentimes what we find is that they're redirected to other majors that people think are more within their realm of what they should be doing based upon stereotypes about their backgrounds and abilities. So absolutely. And again, in this heightened environment, implicit bias is even more intense. So it is possible, certainly, that those messages are even more prevalent now than they were before. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about that and being attentive to that. The other thing that I'd like to offer is, and I put this in the chat if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, that my colleague and good friend, Jennifer Imazeki, who's the Associate Chief Diversity Officer for Faculty Success at San Diego State, has put together a wonderful resource focused on remote teaching with a focus on diversity and inclusion. I put it into, it's like the third or fourth comment in the chat window. If you just go to diversity.sdsu.edu, that's diversity.sdsu.edu/resources, you'll see a link for working and teaching remotely, and we'd certainly recommend that.
Awesome. Next question. This is from an anonymous attendee. So for writing intensive courses, how might we overcome the tech accessibility barriers summarized? So great question. So this is, where we make the point about some of the strategies are going to be more applicable in some contexts than there might be for other contexts. I think when it comes to writing intensive courses where, there has to be a lot of intentional work, almost intentional one-on-one work with students, it might be better to build in some actual class time to do that. So maybe you move away from the whole group instruction for, one class session or two class sessions or part of a class section, and set up individual meetings with students where you can, work with them specifically on some of the things that you're seeing in their writing, addressing their needs, addressing their concerns. Again, I recognize some of you are teaching classes with 40, 50, 60 students. So that might not be feasible. In that case, maybe you do smaller groups instead of one-on-one. But I think sometimes, our learning management systems or things like Zoom, they're great for engaging larger groups. And we may need to move away from those things and do more traditional ways, conference calls or, FaceTime with students in order to address some of their specific needs. So thinking about how, if we were talking about an in-person context, how we might move around the room. You know, the student has a larger assignment that they're working on, and we might move around the room and check in with specific students at specific times, maybe 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. We can do the same thing, but we might have to be more intentional in scheduling those check-ins with students.
So the next question came in the Q&A, and actually there were two questions that were very similar on essentially the assessments that we have from Dennis, and then a very similar question from Kurti. And it basically, one of them is that can the CCIDI, that's that professional development tool that we, not the professional development tool, but the tool that assesses the areas of performance that can form professional development, can that be adapted for use in the CSU? Frank and I can certainly make that available to Emily, to make that available to any institution that would want to use that. And so we can work with anybody who's interested in doing that. But we'd want to work through Emily to be able to facilitate that and make that resource available to anybody. I certainly think that the items that we look at in there are directly relevant to the work that we're doing. Just as a kind of general recap, we're looking at strategies around relationship building, around cultural relevance in the classroom, around the use of strategies that validate students and promote collaborative learning, around intentionally welcoming engagement with students inside and outside of the classroom, which is in this context is inside and outside of maybe our direct class sessions through remote learning, around conveying high expectations for our students, being intrusive, monitoring their performance, which we've talked about a lot here, and then a technique that we call appropriate disclosing, where we talk about our backgrounds and experiences. So yeah, we can certainly make that available if that's helpful.
Next question. And this comes from Daniel. And Daniel asks, I'm trying to think about how to balance two possibly conflicting views. This is a crisis situation that upsets our students' lives, and it's not reasonable to maintain the same expectations we had of students before the crisis struck. And second, how should we maintain high expectations? Because otherwise, we are shortchanging our students and not encouraging them to rise to the challenge. Any thoughts? Again, thanks for your time. Thank you for your question, Daniel. Yeah, I mean, I think we're all probably struggling with those seemingly conflicting demands at the same time. So how do we really, what I hear inherent in the question, Daniel, is how do we hold students accountable for the same level of performance and the same, demonstrating the same competency that we would have in the absence of COVID-19? And then at the same time, how do we exercise flexibility, grace, and, do the things that we can do to, continue to support them so that they're not overwhelmed and so that they don't, drop out or leave the course. And I think right now, thinking about the next, several months, so 3 to 4 months, we have to sort of recognize that, yes, the quality, first and foremost, the quality of our instruction and what we're doing, particularly those of us who never had planned to teach our courses online, that what we're giving students is probably not as good as what they would have gotten had we not been, forced to make the transition and the changes that we had to make. And so I think our expectations of what students are going to do and their level of performance needs to be aligned with what it is we're able to give them in the same context, right? So recognizing that, again, I think Luke did a good job of describing this early. We have to exercise some grace with ourselves, and at the same time, we have to exercise the same level of grace and perhaps maybe even more grace, with our students. So, grading on a curve, but grading on a curve relative to the situation and what we're able to provide students. Again, also, I think with this, with this current situation has in some ways required us to do is to rethink, how we hold how do we hold students accountable for demonstrating learning? So in the past, maybe there was only one or two ways. So exams, for example, and maybe written assignments were the only ways, those were the only two strategies that we relied on. This current situation requires us to be more open and perhaps more accepting of other ways for students to demonstrate their learning, right? So it may mean a presentation instead of an exam. It may mean a number of different things. And so I think, we have to sort of think about it within the framework of, I have to hold students accountable, and my expectations have to be aligned with what I'm giving students, in terms of instruction and support and resources, if that helps.
And then this will be the last question from me. And this is coming from Ellen. It says, with the change to online teaching, some of my students are consistently absent in class, synchronous. How do I get them engaged? And I would say that we have to be very proactive in reaching out to students and engaging them. So if you have a student who's missing class sessions, of course you want to send them, an email. You want to connect with them during using your LMS. You want to, if they're connected to a program that might already be serving them, for example, if they're a student athlete or they're part of like EOPS, you want to be making sure you're reaching out to those individuals and being directly engaged with them. I know that, for example, with our institution at San Diego State, my division, we've identified a number of students that fall within the demographic that we serve, and we are making weekly phone calls to those students to make sure that we're engaging them. We should be having the same level of intensity in terms of engaging our students, particularly the ones that we feel are falling through the cracks. And if, let's say that you're sending an email and that's not getting through, if there's other modalities that you can use to triangulate and reach them, I think that would be important. So that really will require a level of creativity. And I think it will depend ultimately on the institution's policies around whether or not you're allowed to use text-based systems or social media systems, whether or not you're allowed to reach out to certain individuals on campus who can also connect with them. But I do think that the level of intrusiveness needs to be higher to meet the challenges of this current moment. And I also recognize that we've talked a lot about high expectations, but we also talked about giving student a bit of grace and recognizing that there's challenges. I still think that you can maintain high expectations within that, as long as we realize this important point. We can express, and I've learned this from Frank, we can express the tough love that's important for students to hear, but you can't do that unless they know that you care about them first. So tough love devoid of that is not going to be very effective. So it's making sure that the student knows that we care about them personally. We care about their success. We are so vested in them that if they do well, they know that we are going to personally feel like we did well. And similarly, if they stumble, if they fall, if they miss the mark, that we are going to personally feel like we missed the mark, because our linkage together is so interconnected and it's so tightly woven that we have a shared or linked vested interest with them. So that's the kind of thinking and sense making that I think that we need to promote during this time, recognizing that the level of intrusiveness now has to be higher than ever been before.
All right, I'm going to take the last question, and before I do that, I do want to acknowledge a comment that looks like Kurti shared. Is that just make sure we recognize and that we're responsive to our non-tenure track and part-time faculty, making sure that they have access to that they're being supported and that they have access to resources as well. So I do want to highlight that as important. And then I'm going to try to answer. I got two questions that are similar, so I'm going to read them both and I'm going to try to respond to them briefly. So Harnett asked, my students have been using avatars that could be considered as racially insensitive. How should I handle this? Do you have any thoughts on how to handle this? I do not want to draw attention to their avatars, but at the same time, I do not want students to feel uncomfortable. I'll just go ahead and try to answer that one briefly. I would reach out to the students. And I think this is important if you're launching a class. When we talk about community norms and we talk about expectations, I would also talk about avatars and memes and anything that becomes a part of the public domain of our course, to me is subject for discussion and consideration. And it's a matter of telling students, like, I'm not really concerned with what you do outside of the context of our course, but these are the expectations within our class in terms of, appropriate conduct and communication in our virtual learning space. And so I'm going to ask you to reconsider the avatars that you're using. And they're probably going to feel uncomfortable. I would probably, try to do it in a one-on-one, with a one-on-one contact, and not, in the context of the group. But I think that's important to do. Last question is from Eliza. I use breakout rooms extensively, but with 80 students, I cannot monitor. How would you recommend preventing microaggressions in this case? We do a lot of teamwork and did do social contracts at the start of the semester. Yeah, with 80 students, it's hard to do. So the social contracts are, really going to be important. I would also give students permission to hold each other accountable for how they engage in this space, and also give them permission to come to you and, bring things to your attention that you may have to address. And lastly, if you have a graduate student or a TA, maybe you can make, part of that person's responsibility is to check in on the breakout rooms and kind of, monitor as best they can the discussion and make sure that things aren't getting out of hand. So with that, we are going to conclude the webinar. Again, thank you all for participating. And we just wish you all, much success in wrapping up this semester, but also that, you and your loved ones are safe and well as well. And with that, we're going to turn it back over to Emily, and Luke and I are going to step aside. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Frank and Luke. The work that you're doing to promote equity within the entire ecosystem of the education pipeline, P through 20 in California and across the nation, is greatly appreciated. We're very lucky to have you both partly made in the CSU and now leaders in the CSU. And I want to thank everybody who took the time to join today for all that you're doing. We're concerned about your well-being as you are concerned about our students' well-being. As our chancellor has said, when times are difficult, one thing that can help is to remain laser focused on the mission of the CSU, and everything discussed today embodies what has always been at the core of the CSU. I'll be in touch with those of you who registered with your email address to send you the link to that survey if you haven't done it and you want to share with us how you're doing so we can plan more things. As promised, we'll share the link to the recording widely as soon as it's available with an accurate transcript, and we will create a list of resources and organize the comments and suggestions and questions that have gone both through the chat and the Q&A. So with that, once again, thank you for all that you're doing. Be well, and let's all together work on developing an equity presence in these unprecedented times. Thank you.